All right, so let's set one of these up outside of these development REPLs and playgrounds and so forth. Let's set an environment up to use Babel outside of those playgrounds and REPLs. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a directory called ESDemos. So one thing you might wonder is, hey, where should I put this directory? Well, you could put it anywhere, but I'm going to put it right here on the desktop, and I'm actually going to create a folder called code, and then inside of code, I'll put all the different code that we might write in here. So in this case, I want to create a new folder called ESDemos. I could have done this on the command line with this make directory statement, but I'm just going to do it right here. And then I want to open that in Visual Studio Code as the top level folder. So I'm just going to use my editor and drag it right onto Visual Studio Code, and it should open. And yes, it opened with ESDemos as the top level folder. So that people don't get hosed up on this or stuck on this part. If you're new to Visual Studio Code, you'll notice that if I can close, so I'll say File, Close Folder, and it will close that folder. It'll leave Visual Studio open, but you might be tempted to say File Open. But what you really want to do is open a folder in this workspace. So what you would do is either click Open Folder here on the Welcome page, or go over here to your Explorer, and there's a big Open Folder button, and you could navigate specifically to, in this case, the desktop, the code folder, and then I want to highlight ESDemos, and we want that folder to be the top level folder here. So that's the longhand or the manual way of opening this folder up in Visual Studio Code. So this Explorer is just like you'd expect. We can add files, so here's the new file icon, and we can add folders in here. So let's continue on. So we've got this open in Visual Studio Code, and it says open a command prompt or terminal in the ESDemos directory. Again, what I'm going to do is open a terminal right inside of Visual Studio Code, or a command prompt if you're on Windows. What's nice here is if I check what working directory I'm in, you can see that the nice thing is here is I didn't have to change directory into ESDemos. I'm already where I want to be. I'm already in the ESDemos directory. So then I can run these commands. So this should look sort of familiar from what we did in the last package manager section. I'm going to say npm init -y. So what this is going to do is initialize this folder to be ready to record things in this package.json file that we install. And we're going to install some different parts of Babel. Let me go over these with you. So I'm going to npm install dev dependencies. Remember, we're going to make Babel a dev dependency because it's not going to run in production. We're going to write our code in this new JavaScript syntax, and the compiler Babel is going to run on it and output older JavaScript code, and that's what we're going to deploy. So we're not actually going to need Babel to be running in production. We're going to need to just use it at development time to compile our app. So that's why we make these dev dependencies. Babel is made up of a core library, a command line interface that you can use, and some presets that you can configure. And in order to configure those, you need to install this part of the library called preset, or this package, node package called preset env, which is short for environment. So let me go ahead and run that. And while that's running, we'll go back here. And the other thing we need to install is Babel's polyfill core.js at 3. So what this means is it's going to install, let's wait for this to run. So this successfully installed, and you saw those 3 dependencies go in as dev dependencies. Now, if I run this command and I say npm install --save, because these are dependencies that we'll need when the app runs, we're going to fill in the polyfills using core.js. So I'll go ahead and install those, and then I'll take a step back to explain what this polyfill concept is and core.js. There are some new language features in JavaScript that make sense to be implemented at a compiler level. So like we saw, it would make sense to rewrite this class code to this older syntax using prototypes and so forth, or this more lower level syntax using prototypes and so forth in ES5. However, there are some features in JavaScript that make more sense to just kind of fill into the browser and not to compile code on the fly in order to implement them. Let me give you a concrete example. Promises is something that are used to handle asynchronous programming in JavaScript. It's introduced in ECMAScript 2015 or ECMAScript 6, one of the newer versions of JavaScript. And when that was introduced, we could have built it into the compiler, but the compiler would just have to spit out a set of code that implements the promise class over and over and over again. Instead, to help you understand this better, let me look up promise, for example, and I'll look that up on Mozilla Developer Network. We're going to go over promises in detail, so we don't have to understand them in total right now. What we need to understand is that they are implemented as a class. So you see this promise constructor. It's implemented as a class, so you might say new promise, for example. That class, what a polyfill does is it checks to see if the browser has natively implemented in itself the promise class, which Chrome has. But if it hadn't implemented the promise class, it would automatically fill it in for it. In summary, to get these new language features in your browser, you need two things. You need a compiler and you need a polyfill library. So that's what this second line is doing. In order for us to configure Babel, we need to create a config file named babelrc in the root of our project and make this its content. So let's start. I'll grab that on my clipboard and add a file right at the root of the project, and I'll call it .babelrc, a configuration file, and we'll paste these presets into it. And basically what we're saying here is, hey, use core.js as your polyfill and target node 10 right now. So configuring Babel is pretty much done for you in a normal React project, but I like to show some of this basic setup so that you can understand what's going on under the hood. So let's continue on. So in order to run Babel, we would create a file in a source directory called program.js. So this is saying, hey, let's create a folder called src, because this will be where we write our source code, so where we're allowed to use those new language features. And I'll create a file in there called program.js, okay? And then we'll take that file and write a little bit of JavaScript code in it. So here it is. We're just creating a const called greeting of hello, and then we're logging that out. Const is a new feature. Constants didn't exist in JavaScript until ECMAScript 6, which is also known as ECMAScript 2015. They didn't exist before. So we'll see what happens when we run the Babel compiler on this file. So in order to get it running, we need to go into our command prompt or terminal, set the current directory to esdemos, and we've already got one of those set up and running, and run this command. So I'll break this command down. What we're saying is, let me break down this command piece by piece. So npx in this case is doing something a little different than we saw it do the last time. What it's doing is it's running Babel, but it's going to guarantee us, because we put npx in front of this, that it's going to pick up the Babel that is 787 here that we have installed, and not some other Babel that we might have globally installed on the machine or in some other directory on the machine. It's going to compile what's in the src directory. We're going to turn on watch mode. Watch mode basically means that the compiler is going to run a file system watch, and anytime a file changes with the JS extension, it's going to automatically recompile it. What does it do when it compiles it? it's going to output it to a directory called lib. So let's start this up, and it says successfully compiled. And as you can see, if we blow this up a little bit, we can go into, it created a lib directory, and inside there it created a program.js. So let me close all the files we currently have and just open the source file, program.js before compilation, and program.js after compilation. Let's do that again. Program.js before, and then program.js after. Okay. So if we compare these two, we can see just what we saw in the Babel REPL, that online editor that we were using before. And that is that besides the use strict statement here, these are producing the same output. And why it's producing the same output right now is that we are targeting the Node.js environment, and Node understands consts. If we were targeting ES5 or a down-level version of the language, then it would translate const to var. Let me show you that. So right now, as I mentioned, we're targeting just Node 10. But let's say that we needed to target IE, Internet Explorer version 11, for example. Does it know about the const keyword? Well, the way we can tell is if we stop our currently running compiler. Let me do control, so I did control C there to stop it. Restart up the compiler, and then take a look at program.js output. And sure enough, instead of having just const here, it's translated to var because it knows that IE11 won't recognize the const keyword. Lots more configuration there. You can look it up in the Babel documentation about how to do all the configuration here. But what you'll find is when we go to create a React project, we're going to use something called Create React App. Create React App does a good job setting reasonable defaults for all this stuff, so you often don't have to mess with it until later in the project. Okay, so I just want you to understand this stuff and what's going on. So let's go back to our compiler setup. So we now have a compiler set up for JavaScript. So if you're only interested in using Babel, then you can skip the next section. But in the very next section, what I'll do is show you how to set up a TypeScript compiler.